Well, thank you everybody for joining us this morning. We're really happy to have you with us and to have such great presenters today to talk about how you actually win a grant. And then once you've won it, which some people says is the dangerous part, how you effectively manage it for making sure that you can manage it properly and succeed in your effort and become a champion and make yourself that much more eligible for future grants. Our presenters this morning are Chris White, who is with Frontier Energy, and Nicole Bruns, who's with Bruns-Auri Incorporated. And I just wanted to let you know that the recording and the slides from today's presentations will be posted to the Clean Cities events website. And that's this link right here. And you can also, so if you go to our website, just up to the org here and sign up for our newsletter, you will see information about lots of upcoming grants and regulations and upcoming webinars that we'll be doing. So hopefully you'll be ready to sign up for that and get that kind of information. So having given this introduction, I think we're going to lead off with Chris, and Chris White will take us into how you win a grant. And so Chris, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'll turn it over to you to start sharing your screen.
All right. Thanks, Tim, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I see a lot of new faces today or new names that we haven't seen in past webinars. So this is really interactive. This is not a Zoom webinar. It is a Zoom meeting. So you're welcome to come off mute, ask a question, add a comment, or drop it in the chat anytime. We really want this to be interactive. And for my part of this, we're going to talk about some of the things that I have learned in writing grants. And to be clear, I mostly write grants for the state of California, and that is for Energy Commission, Air Resources Board, some for Caltrans, some for other divisions, but also federal grants. And most of my federal grants are coming from the Department of Energy and the Department of Transportation. And in fact, we just started on a DOT grant award that's for virtual reality training. So this is a little bit about what I have learned to do in writing grants. And let me start by really specifying what a grant is. A grant is not an incentive or a rebate. Grants are competitive for the most part. And it is a way that government says you have a good idea or a great project that will provide services to the public and stimulate the economy. And we want to help you do this. So we are going to see in the new federal grants that are coming that it's more than stimulate the economy and public service. There's going to be a lot of effort and focus on climate change and how you build strong, resilient communities. And one of the things the federal government has specifically pointed out is that a grant that benefits a disadvantaged community or left behind community is like plugging holes. And what they want to do is see things that will move that community forward instead of right a past wrong. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But grants are very competitive, and you really need to articulate your idea or project very well and right in line with what the grant is asking for. And we'll talk more about that a little bit too. The other part, and this is what Nicole is going to cover, because grants are funded by taxpayer dollars, they have very, very stringent reporting requirements. You have to show that you are making good use of public money, and you have to back it up with proof points, not with just, I thought it would be a good idea and therefore it is. So first, let's talk a little bit about a grant that is available right now. And that's the CEC Rev Charging Grant. And this is rural electric vehicle charging. And I'm not sure that any of us on this call will apply for this grant. But I want to point out to you what its objectives are. And most grants will tell you that they have 5 objectives and then ask you to articulate your goals. But as you write your narrative and your scope of work, you really want to make sure you are staying true to these objectives and the goals that show you're achieving the objectives. Now, your project may have other objectives and other goals, and that's fine. Don't confuse those in this grant. The more that you add to what they're asking you, you're doing two things. First is you're confusing the reviewer, and the second is you are giving yourself more that you have to document and report. So always make sure that everything you're doing feeds back into one of the objectives that the grant writer, the RFP writer, says we want to achieve with the use of public money. So now let me show you a couple of things that I have learned to do before you start writing the grant, before you ever put pen to paper, do anything else. Make sure your legal team reviews the contract terms and conditions. I learned this one the hard way, is that we got all the way through with something. I had spent hours writing it. It was a great program. Then I asked our folks to look at the contract terms and condition, which included turning over intellectual property, which we are not going to do. So make sure you can comply with this. This also includes insurance requirements. For instance, most grants require that you have workers' compensation insurance. And if you are a single person business, you probably don't have workers' compensation. So you want to make sure that you have a way to address everything that they're asking for. Many of them have very steep insurance requirements for liability and automotive. If you cannot meet those, you want to be prepared to ask the issuer if they have an alternative to meeting that for a single person business. Next is you're going to read the scope of work and the RFP many times. Now, if you've ever seen an Energy Commission grant, they have like 14 different documents, and each document has a little piece of the puzzle. Things from the federal government tend to be one document, and they only give you like 5 paragraphs of what they want. So read very carefully and make sure that you know how you're going to address every point. The next is you really want to identify partners. Grant applications are stronger when you have a good, solid team. So if it has elements of workforce development or equity, and every state of California grant requires that you do public outreach in disadvantaged areas and with unengaged communities, that you have an element of workforce development. So you have to show those in every single one. So know that you have partners that can do that, and get them on board about your vision and where you want to go with this. One thing you cannot do is say to be determined later, or you'll put an RFP out for something. Governments want to know that you have thought something through very carefully and you know exactly how you're going to do it. Not that you're kind of, once we win the money, then we're going to go out to bid. They want to know that you have some specificity. Doesn't mean you have to do it that way. It could be that you say, we have identified this partner or these 3 partners that we'll want to work with, but show them that you've thought it through. Nearly all grants ask for letters of support. Some of them don't, and if they don't, you want them anyway. In my experience, getting the letters of support is the most difficult part. It seems like we are always ready to submit, and we're still waiting for people to finish letters of support. Often organizations have to go, particularly nonprofits, have to take it to their board for board approval, and the board only meets once a month. So put the notice out there to everybody that you want to write a letter, have a template that you want them to complete, and give them a date that's like 2 weeks before your grant is due, and ask for them to be returned. You also want to make sure you have updated resumes for everybody on your team and updated references, because that's, again, a thing that is a scramble at the end. Who's going to be on this project? Oh, they haven't updated their resume in 5 years. The grantor wants to know that you have picked your team, and that you have picked your team carefully, and that that team matches the scope of work. And then finally, decide who's going to do the writing. And one of the things that I often do is I'll take the whole grant in Word, kind of summarize it, and then add who's responsible for different sections. So everybody knows who's supposed to write what. And then I send my team regularly a punch list of when different pieces are due. But if you don't have this decided, what you'll end up with is 3 people writing the same piece and nobody writing the other piece. And it's a little funky at the end when you're trying to put the whole thing together. So before I move on, I'm going to ask if anybody has a question or a comment or something that they might want to share from their own grant writing experience that should go on my before you start writing list.
Miss Chris, I have a question. This is Gina O'Neill from the Air District and also co-coordinator with Sacramento Clean Cities. Good morning.
Yes, Gina. Good morning.
By chance, do you have an example or a sample that you could whoop up at some point showing how you do that phenomenal assigning people tasks? You know, getting a real visual on how you organize that would be super helpful.
Okay, you know what, Gina, that's a great idea. And I will put that in my post. I'll put that in a follow-up. I'll give you guys some examples of like punch lists that I use and how I split things up among people. So you can see that as a guideline.
I save that and I now use that to organize my own grant applications, and it's just proven to be so helpful. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. All right, so let's, at any time you can drop something in the chat or just come off mute and add to this. So when I sit down to write the grant, then these are my 6 rules that I've developed over time, just because I think it's the easiest way to approach it. The first is I start with the scope of work. This is the thing that says we're going to do this task. This is the goal of this task. These are the steps to do this task and what my deliverables are. Remember that with the government grant, anything that you have as a deliverable is a thing that they post on their website. So if it is, we're going to develop a website that's not a deliverable. They're not going to post a website. Probably what you're going to say is the deliverable is a wireframe for the website. Or if you're going to develop a data collection platform, your deliverable is going to be documentation of how you're going to collect and share the data. So everything that's deliverable is something on a piece of paper, a PDF, or something you're going to email with your report. And I think Nicole's going to talk a little bit more about this. But when you have a big team, make sure everybody agrees on the scope of work, because you don't want to get near the end and somebody goes, oh, that's not how we do that piece. Follow the format of the RFP. When you get it, or the scope of work, it'll have headers, very specific headers, like the Energy Commission say, team qualifications, past experience, how you manage risk. Follow that format. And one of the reasons that you want to do that is the people who review the proposals don't necessarily work in that division. And a good example I can give you is Department of Energy. When we submitted grant or proposals that were about vehicle electrification, the reviewer that we had who gave me comments worked in the nuclear energy department. So when they get hundreds or thousands of applications, it gets parsed out to people. And if you can follow their format, it makes it really easy for them to know that you addressed every point in their grant. Don't add extra information. In some cases, extra information like an introduction or overview of local objectives will get your grant disqualified for being non-responsive. So if you have additional information, the best way to do it is get it written in as a letter of support. So, if you have I just got off a call from the city of Sacramento about building electrification. If you want to write that in there as kind of our vision is building electrification, doesn't go in this, but you can have somebody from the city write a letter of support that says, we have this overall vision of building electrification, and this is how this project will fit into that. That's the way you squeeze in extra information. Make sure you're addressing specific goals, serves the public, good use of tax dollars. You'll see things in there. It's usually in the RFP, it's usually in the background information. Make sure you're always going back to say, this is a good use of public funds because, be very clear, which gets me to the next one, which is words and phrases from the RFP verbatim. I am not talking about copy and paste a whole section, but if they say something like, show how your application addresses the needs of people in this situation. You're going to say, this proposal addresses the needs of these people in these situations because. Again, it's like that checklist for the reviewer to know that you have addressed every point that they're really looking for. A big one is to avoid jargon and industry lingo. Those are words that we might use internally, but people who are outside the organization or outside the industry don't know what that is. And again, a good example is a lot of my colleagues work on buildings, and we talk about LIHEAP all the time, and they talk about LIHEAP this and LIHEAP that and LIHEAP this, and I see it in documents. I had no idea what LIHEAP was, which is a low-income heating program. So be really careful to make sure that your reviewer is not reading weird words that might just be internal. And one of the things about this specifically in vehicles, we talk about a certain type of truck in a certain way. Let's call it a dump truck or a water pumper. That's great if you describe it. If you're writing a DOT grant, you want to use DOT's words, in which they will talk about incomplete trucks or chassis that are upfit to be dump trucks. So be very clear that you're using the words that your grantor uses. And the last part of this is to make sure that everything matches to a T. You will have multiple forms that you're uploading. One might be the address of work. Another is going to be your budget justification. Another is going to be CEQA documents or background things, the narrative, the scope of work, and they all need to match. We got caught on this one time in a really big grant and got disqualified for it because in our budget justification, which is in Excel, we said one number was going to be something, and in the narrative, we actually had a different number and it was only off by $5, and we got disqualified because that $5 didn't match. So allow yourself time and a different person to go through and make sure every number matches, every number of the scope of work matches, every deliverable matches, every address matches, that it's all together. Okay, I'm going to stop again. Questions, comments, rules that you'd like to throw out to me that you learned the hard way or the easy way?
Chris, this is Tim. I just wanted to reiterate, you mentioned earlier that reviewers could be unrelated to the group that actually will be responsible for funding the project. And I think relative to your comment about everything matching, it plays into that in that when you have 300 grants to review, you look for any reason you possibly can to reject that work that you have to do in reviewing that grant to get the number down to something that is actually manageable and achievable, which is why a $5 discrepancy between two documents can cause your entire grant to be thrown out, no matter how good the actual application is, because the nuclear engineer who's reviewing your vehicle application just wants to have fewer grants to review. So it's an unfortunate process that just exists.
It is, and I just turned in one yesterday for a utility program outside of California that we had to put in 2 different budget sheets, and it was a lot of effort to make that calculated things 2 different ways. One way we had to show it by hours, another way we had to show it by task, and it was a lot of effort to make those 2 different sheets add up to exactly the same number. So just be really careful of that. All right, a couple of gotchas that I want to tell you. Again, you could say that $5 was a gotcha. Just to be aware of and be planned for. Most grants start later than expected. They may say they expect to announce awards in April. It could be April of next year before it finally does get awarded. And some of that's just the way that government funds programs. They have to have, particularly federal, they have to have committed funds before they're allowed to allocate the funds. And the federal government, if you have a multi-year program, all of the funding for that multi-year program has to come out of the current fiscal year. So sometimes they have to let something roll to the next fiscal year. Other times it has to go on a docket somewhere. It has to be approved by a board, and it gets bumped because other things come up that are very time sensitive. So just be aware that if you say my project has to start in April, if it doesn't start in April, it's dead, then you may not get these funds for 3 or 6 months or a year later. And is that going to put your project dead in the water? The second part is visiting the submission portal. Some places just have you email something. Others have a portal that you have to use. Department of Energy has a portal that you have to go through, and the portal can be tricky. It has DOE portal, which is called EERE Exchange, has multiple tabs and you have to fill out information in each tab, and sometimes it's duplicative information. You have to upload forms at certain areas and not other areas. So visit that early. Again, I applied for a program in Minnesota for Minnesota's Department of Commerce, wrote this beautiful grant, went to the portal, wrote this beautiful thing, had pictures, had charts, went to the portal. There's no document upload. Instead, it was cut and paste, ask a question, paste your answer, and you could only have 500 characters. So I was freaking out at the last minute to try to get my whole proposal uploaded and short enough to fit. Visit the portal first. Most government grants require that you have some type of cost share. That cost share can be in kind, like a salary of a person. It can be cash, which would be matching money from another project. Whatever you're getting, your cost share, you have to document it. You have to be able to, so if you're matching with hours, you have to record those hours, and then you have to be able to report those hours. You also have to show that you are not double counting your money. If you got grant A and you're using it on cost share on grant B and C, you can't use the same money twice. So once money has been spent as cost share, it's kind of out of your savings account. You don't get to use it again. Be prepared to document, be prepared for them to question your documentation. And I think Nicole's going to talk a little bit more about that time. When you are figuring your budget on a government grant, you need 2 or 3 times the number of hours for project management meetings and reporting than you think you need. Be sure you factor that in. It is way better to budget too many hours than too few hours. And you will be surprised how much time it takes to meet even once a month with the CEC or DOE lead, and then more times with your project team to keep the whole thing going forward. The last thing I want to say is on your scope of work, watch the number of tasks and subtasks that you have and deliverables, because everything that you say you are reportable for. And one of the projects that we worked on a few years ago, we were a subcontractor on it, had, I think, 12 tasks, many of them with deliverables that were right on top of each other, and lots of deliverables. And it was really very difficult to achieve. And that 12 tasks, the learning was we could have slimmed that down probably 5. We could have reduced the number of deliverables by maybe 75% and still have achieved everything in that project plan. You also want to really watch your timelines on it, because consider the fact that if you have a report that's due, you may have 5 people that have to contribute to the report. You're going to need to do a first draft, a second draft, and a final draft. So make sure that you are watching the timeline on that. And for state of California grants, all of your final reports and documentation have to be in 60 days before the end of your project. So watch that as well, and do not promise something that you can't achieve. Gina, I hear you're off mic, so you must have a comment here.
Yes, ma'am. So something that you said about, dang it, give me a second. Something that you said about, not overpromising, maybe making your tasks and your subtasks too complex. because once you put it in writing, you must perform those tasks. And so is there a balance between, narrowing down 12 to 5? Do you get more vague, or when do you know that they're going to appreciate more detail than not? Do you understand the
So
question?
a really good example of this is with stakeholder or technical advisory committee meetings. If you promise that after, what you're going to do is give them a list of technical advisory members, you're going to give them a list of everybody you invited and then who accepted, meeting minutes from every meeting, agendas for every meeting, and what, picture of every person. That's a lot of deliverables. Instead, I would say that on a quarterly basis, you're going to submit all of the notes and outcomes from technical advisory committee meetings. That's so much easier to manage than constantly sending documents and updates.
Great, thank you. And also, and I apologize, I got distracted for a moment. Have we talked at all yet about what happens when you don't get the grant? What we should do as far as why or follow up or any of that?
That's a really great point. So if you get your grant and you find out you didn't win, with the Energy Commission, they release what they call a NOPA, a Notice of Proposed Award, and you'll see things about who passed, who didn't pass, and who was disqualified. So if you passed but didn't win, it's always great to ask for a debrief, and they'll go through with you and talk to you about the scoring. I find the Energy Commission to be extraordinarily helpful in helping you write a stronger grant next time. The Department of Energy is more vague. They just kind of say they'll send you a letter that say why you didn't pass, and they really won't go in any more detail than that. And again, it's just the volume of responses that a national grant gets. They just don't have time to debrief every single person. But always ask for a debrief. Always ask how you can do it better next time, what you might have missed. Because some of those things that I told you about, like the $5, I wouldn't have known about that if I hadn't asked for the debrief.
Can you give a quick example of something valuable that we've learned on a grant that if we had known better, we would have probably been awarded? For instance,
the letters of
issue?
support. The letters of support, that was a huge learning for me last year. I thought the letters of support were kind of perfunctory, and maybe they just counted them and said, oh, they've got 12, or skimmed through and looked at the names on them. But this idea that you can squeeze extra information in about local objectives or past projects or other things to get those in the letters of support, and that they read those and they actually read those as though they are part of the grant narrative. That was a huge lesson learned for me in the last year.
Thank you very much. Super helpful.
We're at the halfway point. I want to make sure Nicole gets plenty of time for hers. So if you stop, perfect, Chris. If you stop sharing and Nicole starts, then I think we can move to the next part of it and have enough time maybe at the end for a few questions.
So now that you've won the grant, you have to report and you have to document. And Nicole is going to talk to you about that.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicole Bruns. I am the owner and a documentation specialist at Bruns-Auri Incorporated, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that provides environmental education, working with entities and organizations on sustainability solutions or helping to meet and maintain carbon neutrality goals. My experience, I've written several reports for state and federal funded electric vehicle projects, working with EV school buses and light duty electric vehicle incentive programs. So today I will be talking about what I've learned for reporting basics, such as like indicators, looking for indicators that will be needed in reports, frequency of reports, and tips on managing and collecting data. I also talk about
Nicole, what is an indicator?
So indicators would be like keywords either within an application or that you can pull from the grant application, or once you've been awarded within the grant agreement, that will either explicitly tell you what to report on, or in some cases it's a little bit more intuitive. So kind of looking for what type of data you'll need to report on.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And then, so I'll finish off with talking about writing for the why, the how, and the what through examples of different audiences who may be reading your report. Starting off, there's a few reporting basics and again, indicators to keep in mind when deciding what is required for reporting. Not all reports will be treated the same. Some have higher items of importance, but each report typically will follow the same kind of template. And so to find out what is needed to be reporting, you'll want to look at the grant requirements, and which can be identified in the application or the agreement. And hopefully you'll be working with an agreement that does explicitly tell you what needs to be reported on. So if you're looking at the application, you'll want to do some digging around for information or keywords that documentation is needed. And that will also help clue you in on what specifics need to be reported on. And those specifics would be, the type of data you need to collect. If you're working with, lower incomes, maybe there's some workforce development that you'll need to report on and keep allocated narrative for. And so if you are working with, or if you're looking at your grant agreement and, assuming after you've won the award, again, reporting needs and timelines may be explicitly stated, and the template usually will have examples of, data, funding expenditures, outreach narrative. You'll want to provide lessons learned or best practices. And then you'll conclude your reports usually with a future outlook or recommendations on how to improve the project or program. And then you'll wrap it up with sustainability, how to make this program last after grant funding has been expended, or how you can find the need for more funding to keep this program in place, or these chargers running, et cetera. So continuing with some of the basics, I just want to kind of dive into some examples. I'm very example oriented. That helps me kind of visualize what's needed for a report. So I've pulled an example from the CEC's Rural Electric Vehicle Charging Grant funding opportunity application. So most of the reports are going to be written to showcase the project benefits. And so looking at this example, let's find some indicators of what may be needed in a report for this type of grant. The first bullet that is highlighted has the keywords at the end of the sentence: emission reductions, public health, economic, and cost-saving benefits. To me, as someone who writes reports, these are indicators to me that what data I want to collect should be within each one of these criteria. So, I wanted to collect data on emission reductions. I'm going to want to collect data or survey, public health, or include data on the surrounding communities, like public health data, which can be pulled from, government websites or Department of Public Health, and then economic and cost-saving benefits. So this is highlighted again later on. This is what you will want to use in your report to prove that the taxpayer money is, going toward a project that is beneficial, that's working, is viable. And another key to look at is the economic benefits. So if you're working with a community, you'll want to showcase workforce development. And these will, so I left the list of the examples on the right side. So when you're looking into like funding or reporting on funding expenditures, you'll want to include your cost saving benefits and economic benefits. And then the third item that I have highlighted, especially the item in blue, it's in blue because that right there tells you documented and reasonable. You're going to want to have documentation because sometimes not every agreement or application will explicitly say, you will need to submit, X amount of reports in your project timeline. And so that right there, the blue highlight tells me that, I'm going to need to keep a robust or keep up to date with information so I can produce a robust report that, in this case, in this example, minimizes the cost of charging for drivers. And the examples or the narrative that I include in the reporting, is presented in a reasonable way that can be proved with, certain type of data collection items like.
Nicole, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
How do you overcome, for instance, if it's a little bit vague about you need to turn in a monthly report or you need to turn in a quarterly report and here's what you need to have included? What if that's not in those requirements? Is there a way other than just documenting everything? Is there a way to, how would you make sure that you're kind of documenting the correct stuff?
So you'll want to make sure you're documenting the correct items by, it's sort of like a convoluted answer, but by looking at like the project benefits and seeing that, in this project, for example, you'll want to minimize the cost of charging. If you're asking like the frequency of reporting, that.
Who would you ask? I think is what I'm asking. I'm sort of advocating that you talk to the contract manager maybe, and then you can ask them directly on whoever it is that you report to.
Yeah, so assuming that the person applying for the grant is also doing the reporting, you'll want to ask your grantor when you're coming up with the grant agreement or the contract, you can directly ask like, how often are you going to need reporting? Oftentimes, in my experience, the frequency of reports is outlined within the grant agreement. And it's also used or submitted when you are submitting like invoices for payment, because the reports are used as for accountability as well.
So what I hear you saying is that you can do your own analysis based on what is actually in the requirement section, and you can talk to your grantor, whoever's in charge of your grant. And oftentimes I find if I just ask, what would you like me to highlight in the documentation? That prevents me from having to document everything, not really knowing what they want to see. And so I think that would be useful.
Yeah, so so I'll just jump to the last bullet that I've highlighted, the words knowledge transfer. And so, this really quick, this is also another indicator that a robust report is needed for highlighting highlighting your collected data and program happenings, not only to showcase the benefit of the project, but also serves as a document that anyone can pick up and learn how to emulate the similar project. As well as, since we are in a time of continuous advancements with electric vehicle technology and alternative fuel technology, reporting presents the opportunity to let people know the benefits of converting to this technology is, sorry, my daughter is trying to present with me. So it's that this technology or this project that you're bringing into this community is workable, it's viable, and writing a successful report that proves the success of maximizing your data to help tell the story, will ensure that, that this sorry, I lost my train of thought. That this project, you know, is worth the funding that's going toward it. And so by keeping, so again, like as Gina mentioned, you know, having an open line of communication with someone that is going to be receiving your reports, or someone that's, you know, the grantor, you know, is key in having, you know, or not, well, it's helpful when you're writing reports, because then you'll know what areas you need to focus on, what areas you're missing. They'll be in some cases, they'll be very blunt, saying, we don't need this at all, scrap this, and please just focus on, you know, collecting. If you're working with electric vehicle or electric chargers, you know, just focus on what's coming out of the meter. Or, you know, they'll want to know more about workforce development, such as how is this benefiting the community, you know, is this getting people to job trainings, or, you know, are people in the community able to work on the project itself? So hopefully that answers your question, Gina, that you brought up, and gives a little bit more clarity to that. And then the last bullet on this slide is the correlates with the sustainability example. When you're wrapping up your report, you'll want to conclude your report with how it can continue on, and provide reason through, you know, drawing conclusions with your data that you've collected, for why more funding is needed for the project you're working on, and ensuring that this successful project can persist beyond grant funding. So how often are you going to want to report? This is up to, you know, staff capability especially, but also what is required in the grant agreement, or just speaking with someone from the grantor team, company, organization. So in order to kind of get a better sense of what frequency of reports you might need for your project, if you're solely reporting on like financial, budget, funding expenditures, a monthly report will probably serve you best. Monthly reports in general are good for in-house reporting, kind of just keeping up to date with, you know, your development plans, your implementation plans, making sure you're following your project timeline. The typical reports that are submitted are quarterly and annually, but especially annually and final reports. So the quarterly is really good for if you have a lot of like outreach that you're doing, a lot of narrative within the project. You know, it's beyond just, you know, we put in chargers and this is the construction or the plan of the construction, and then plan of like implementation. But if you're doing a lot of boots on the ground outreach, you're working with the community and community-based organizations for workforce development, you're probably going to want to have quarterly reports, so that you can, you know, especially set up your annual reports. But, you know, it's a lot easier to follow, you know, 4 reports than one giant report that has so much information. It's hard to kind of sift through. You know, the average person isn't really going to want to pick it up and read it. Or if it's someone doing a study at like a UC or a university, you know, it's a lot easier to follow along when the report's a bit shorter. Yep. And then annual reports are all your happenings during the year. It includes your budget, it includes funding expenditure, and then all the narrative, and your data collection as well. And then final reports, they're just typically after 1 year of completion, but the timeline will range. I've worked on reports where I've had to sift through 5 years of data and 5 years of narrative to make a final report. So now let's look at some tips for managing, tracking, and collecting data. First off, you're always going to want to determine what data is needed. And you can find out what data is needed by looking again at your grant requirements or in the grant application and the grant agreement. If you look back, in my experience, when I've looked back at the grant application, it's helped give a little bit more background as to why a specific data needs to be collected. And so when you're also determining the data that you need, if you're, for example, if you're working with electric vehicles, you'll want to pull electric vehicle data. And then if you're working with or wanting to put together data on the public, or not on the public, but data for the public and working with the public, you'll want to develop surveys and then use your survey results as advocacy for your data or improvements to the program. So data isn't always, it isn't always just numbers that you're putting to paper. It's, it's survey results. It's, it could be, development at your project or program. And also, when you are doing surveys, it can help discover what type of data you may need that you may be lacking as well when you're looking at the results. And then if you are so sticking with the example of collecting vehicle data, if you are, you'll want to identify some key parameters for tracking and also a timeline of when you need the data. So if you are sticking with quarterly reports, you'll want to make sure that you get your data and you'll be able to work with other partners within your program to get that data before the quarterly report is due. So that's another thing when you are working on the grant application, is making sure that the partners you're working with, if there's any confidentiality breaches that you need to go over before you collect and submit data, because, if you're working with state or federal funding and you're submitting reports, it's all going to be public knowledge. So just making sure that you can work with all of your partners to get the data when you need it is very crucial in getting reports submitted on time. Because again, in some cases, reports are used, some percentage of your funding may be withheld until these reports are submitted, because funders want to ensure that, the money is going to the, I don't want to say to the right place, but the benefits of the program, are working, and the funding and taxpayers' money is going to places that bring economic growth and improve the quality of people's lives, especially those who could be in disadvantaged communities and lower income that oftentimes are suffering from, poor health quality. And then when you are when you are identifying key parameters, you'll want to take account of all the data that's needed. So if we're sticking with the example of vehicles and you're working with charging infrastructure, example of a data would be how much kilowatts are being produced. Finally, when collecting the data, you are going to need to consider all the needs and methods for collection. And one of the projects I've worked on, they installed electric vehicle chargers, but they didn't, at the time of installation, they didn't install a readable meter. So these are just little things to kind of keep in mind. At that time when that grant, in that grant agreement, there wasn't any dialogue on, we will need in reports, information, direct information of the kilowatts per hour used at this specific charger or at all chargers in the program. And so at the time of when you are developing your project and thinking about what reporting may be needed, just little items like that is something to be cognizant of. And then another example that's not related to if you're doing the developing of a project, but when you're working with certain data, you'll want to know what type of information you may need, such as, or the material that you may need access to, which is, I've included an example of an emission calculation. So you'll either want to speak with your grantor if they have a specific emissions calculation you need to use, or a specific calculator. This example is pulled from California Air Resources Board emissions calculator, or co-benefits emissions reduction calculator. And so, you know, for them, they have very specific items that they need to showcase, such as carbon dioxide equivalence reduction, nitrous oxide reduction, PM reduction, reactive organic gas reduction, and vehicle miles traveled. And then also the travel cost savings. So these are just a few tips of collecting and managing data. I do want to take a little pause before I move on to the rest of the presentation if anyone has questions about data. I'll check. So moving forward, you'll want to write, so there's 3 audiences that you're going to want to write your report for. I'm going to try to get through this really quickly, but the general rule is you're going to want to write for policymakers, technical, and the public, and you'll want to tailor your reports to each reader. So who are your policymakers? They're people either they're professionals working within the legislature, or they are educators working within the education system. And they're going to be asking you why does the program matter? Why should funding continue to go to this project? And what's going to change? So when you're writing a report, you'll want to make sure that you can answer, why was this data collected, or why were these charges put in, etc. Your technical are going to be asking how. They'll be like your engineers and planners. They'll ask, how is the program sustainable? How can it be improved or more efficient? And how can expansion be possible? And then the public is going to ask what. They're, in general, most people have an 8th grade reading level or a 5th grade reading level. So you want to be able to keep that in mind when you're writing reports, and make sure you can, when you are reporting, you're also answering, what the program is benefiting, and be able to answer what's happening in the surrounding area. And that can include like workforce development. And then at the very least, just making sure that your information is easy to understand. So to conclude, why, how, and what you're wanting the biggest thing with reports that I've learned is being able to write for all 3 audiences within one document. Because especially if you're writing quarterly, monthly, and then annually reports, you'll want to keep a detailed account of necessary data, which is beneficial if you are writing multiple reports. And a big tip is that technical writing is efficient and comprehensible, and is able to be a document that is written for 3 different audiences. So anyone, a policymaker, an engineer, someone off the street can pick up your report, read it, and know what's happening with the project. So thank you, everyone. I know there's a lot of information to kind of dive into, but if there's any questions or if you have further inquiries, please reach out to me. My contact info is on the screen.
Excellent. Okay, well, I'm going to make a couple of concluding remarks so that if anybody has to jump off, they can. And then if people have questions, we can continue past that point. But I just wanted to be sure that that I reminded everyone, excuse me, excuse me, I need to share my screen here so that we have this back up so people have your contact, both people's contact information here. And also remind everyone that the presentation and the recording from today will be posted to the site. And I think Chris volunteered to supply some additional documentation, excuse me, some additional documentation that were sort of examples that she had sort of lived through and survived the slings and arrows of the application process. So that will all be posted within a couple of days to our Clean Cities website. And with that, I'd like to officially thank Chris and Nicole. And then I'm also going to say, I'm going to say, if anybody has any questions, we can keep going for a little while if people do have questions. So please feel free to jump in either in the chat or unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd like. And if not, we'll see what happens here.
So I just put, I know it's hard to click a Zoom screen, so I just put Nicole's email address and my email address in the chat. Feel free to contact us directly if we can help you. Tim, I have already emailed you the template that Gina was talking about. I slimmed it way down so you didn't see a lot of the conversation, but it gives you an idea of kind of how we think about planning for writing a grant. So anybody want to come off camera and make a comment or an addition or a thing that you're still super fuzzy or suddenly had a light bulb moment about?
I would like to just say that the Energy Commission and the Air Resources Board seem to be producing about one grant opportunity a day these days. They're just flowing out of those agencies. And so getting yourself prepared and using and knowing how to get these things lined up so that you're really applying for the grant that's being offered. I guess that's one of the main points that Chris said. Make sure you're actually applying for the grant that they're actually offering and not trying to write up some unique thing all by yourself that you're trying to tailor and force into a square peg in a round hole. But there will be enormous amounts of money available, and Chris and Nicole are excellent resources for us to be able to take advantage of and going after the funding, especially I don't know for sure where everybody is from, but I'm particularly anxious for us to get as much of this money into the Sacramento region as possible. So
we're certainly going to see a lot of information, a lot of funding coming for EV charging stations. I have a feeling a lot of that very specific money for EV charging stations, the lead applicants will be the charging station providers. But also just keep in mind that it's not just CEC grants for charging stations or hydrogen stations. There will be money coming for more workforce development, which could be a job training program within your company or the ability to do an apprenticeship program or write some curriculum. There will also be money coming just overall for building electrification. And if you are looking at building electrification, there is no, some of those grants will allow you to install EV charging as you are upgrading your school or doing something different. So keep your eyes open. There are lots of resources out there for getting on lists to be mailed about grants. Or just hit me up every once in a while and I'll tell you what I know is in the pipe and what's coming and how competitive I think things are going to be.
And we also, just as a reminder, if you subscribe to our newsletter, we put in there anytime anybody comes out with a grant, we put it in there. So it looks like we don't have anybody who's raising their hand or asking a question. So we'll thank everybody for joining us. Thank you, Chris and Nicole, for your presentations. Everything's going to be posted up to our Clean Cities website within a couple days. And with that, we'll wrap it up.